But I think that what you're pointing at, understanding that our relationship with the relational web is not one of salvation, but one of recognition and acknowledgement and interaction with, I think that allows us to actualize teachings on love and compassion that are more in alignment with what love actually is.
Welcome to the Passing Through Podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments. I speak with thinkers, authors, artists, teachers, and everyday humans who have touched the edge of the ordinary and found something to bring back. I want to start off by saying that I enjoy speaking to all of my guests. I try to get in contact with people who I think have important things to say, or who might offer something helpful or insightful that could potentially enrich the lives of the listeners of this show. Sometimes I have the honor of speaking with a guest that I would have never dreamed of speaking with. That's happened to me a few times on the show already. And today's guest is one of those. Josh Schrei is the creator and host of the Emerald podcast, one of my own personal favorite podcasts. And Josh isn't just an educator or storyteller or music maker or a writer or a pioneer. In terms of podcasting, he is one of the best to ever do it. And that's not hyperbole. He is an absolute juggernaut. So I was thrilled to speak with him. It was a deep pleasure to be able to speak with him. So if you're curious about spirituality, Buddhism, the collision of Western consciousness with Eastern animist cosmologies, practical practices for orienting your mind with the land, loving kindness, also known as Metta, as an animist force strong enough to halt charging elephants, bardic visions of the storyteller, rhythms as living entities, the sonic nature of the universe, Little Richard, Old Dirty Bastard, festival culture, and Burning Man, or just creating a collective field where group alchemy can take place, then friends, this is the episode for you. This is such a deep, juicy, wet watermelon of an episode. And in case this is the first time you're tuning in, to help you get the most out of this episode, I'd like to spend a quick moment defining a couple of terms you'll hear in our conversation. So let's go back to school for a second for some vocab lessons. The word of the day is animism. Animism is the ancient understanding that the world around us is not a dead backdrop where we live out our lives, but instead a vibrant, shimmering world of interconnection and responsibility. So in this understanding, animacy or animism or the animate world just means humans are alive, trees and flowers and bees are alive, and rivers and mountains and stones are alive and conscious and have their own agency and intelligences. It's the understanding that the world is populated by human and non-human intelligences in a vast web of relationship. To quote animist scholar Graham Harvey, the world is full of persons, only some of which are human. Another word you'll hear us use is bodhisattva.
Bodhisattva.
This word comes from the Sanskrit word bodhi, meaning awakening or enlightenment, and sattva, meaning being. So a bodhisattva is a being who vows to awaken not for their own personal liberation, but for the liberation of all beings. This is a special kind of being who chooses not to escape the world into nirvana, but rather to remain in these cycles of samsara, helping others awaken. The other thing I wanted to mention, since we'll be speaking quite a bit about Buddhism, is that there are several different branches in Buddhism. Because when a lot of us hear the term Buddhism, we think of just one thing. But the term Buddhism actually is an umbrella term, like Christianity. Because within Christianity, there are many different denominations of Christianity. You have the Catholics, the Protestants, the Lutherans, Mormons, Evangelicals, Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans, etc. And inside of Buddhism, you have three main branches: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And within those branches, you have further delineations. For example, Zen Buddhist traditions fall under the branch of Mahayana, and Tibetan Buddhism falls under Vajrayana. Some people even categorize the Vajrayana branch as a branch of Mahayana rather than its own distinct branch, because it shares so many philosophical underpinnings with Mahayana. So depending on who you speak to, you'll have 2 or 3 different branches and many schools and traditions within those branches. So Buddhism isn't just one big monolithic thing. It actually has a lot of nuance. Okay, the lesson's over, and now you're equipped with all the words and concepts you'll need to surf the wave of this conversation. So let's find out whether life is, as Buddhism suggests, just a cold calculus of karmic causality generated from your individual actions moment to moment, or whether there might be something more complex and relational at play. All the links you'll need to find Josh will be in the show notes. As always, be good to one another. Remember that the funk is the space between the notes, and that the Wu-Tang Clan ain't nothing to fuck with. So, Josh Schrei, welcome to the Passing Through podcast. I am absolutely honored to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's nice to have one of those conversations that's happening somewhere between the middle of the Pacific Ocean and a van in Poland.
Yeah, for sure. It's I think this is the latest that I've ever spoken to someone. It's like 9:00 for me over here, so it's a first for me. Before we start, though, I just wanted to begin by making an offering of gratitude for the work that you do, not just in the field of animisty, but also in storytelling and podcasting, because I feel like you're doing pioneering work that pushes the format forward into new frontiers. So whenever I share an episode of The Emerald, I'm always telling people to think of it less as a podcast and more of a kind of like sonic collage where it's just dripping with the wet glue of story and atmospheric chanting and pop culture references, all interlaced with myth. And it makes this really immersive, almost hallucinogenic auditory journey. So thank you for your passion and your voice and your contributions.
Oh, thank you. That's exactly the intent. You've picked up on it well, the collage element and the journeying element. And yeah, it's meant to spark feeling and it's meant to take us somewhere. And, we've gotten kind of used to existing art forms, and it's good to try to reimagine those existing art forms and ask ourselves like what a 90-minute song would be like, or how can you reimagine what a podcast could be? And I'm trying, and I appreciate the gratitude. I appreciate when it lands, and just makes me want to explore more stories and dive deeper in.
There's a quote I wanted to start with as well, because it touches on some of the stuff you just said, particularly about art, but I think it also marries some of the other things will likely speak about like animism and the land. And so I kind of wanted to plant the seed as like a little thing that we could return to and water throughout the conversation.
Mm.
And it's by Gertrude Stein. So feel free to react or not. I just want to put it in the space. And the quote is, "After all, anybody is as their land and air is. Anybody is as the sky is, low or high, the air heavy or clear. And anybody is as there is wind or no wind there. It is that which makes them, and the arts they make, and the work they do, and the way they eat, and the way they drink, and the way they learn, and everything."
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So yeah, I just wanted to float that in there because I think this land acknowledgement and taking into account elemental forces and things that often go invisible is an important aspect of the types of things I'd like to speak to you about. And I know that these are passions for you.
Mm. Yeah, that quote reminds me of how in the modern world we've kind of adopted a hard line between the subject and object and isolated ourselves as individual units alone in a dead universe. And how the reality is much different than that, and we are hollow vessels through which the land and the airs express. And so it asks us to investigate a deeper vision of what the self is, what the individual is, and spread our roots a little bit deeper and raise our branches a little bit higher and weave a web of interconnectivity.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that was something that's been alive in me for the last 10 days or so. I was serving on a Vipassana retreat, and it was the second time I've been at a Vipassana retreat. The first was as a sitter, and this time was as a server. And I felt something different this time. I don't know if it's because of my exposure to these kind of ideas, but I felt there was this strong isolationist, highly individualistic, disconnected, detached observer, almost scientific materialist focus on sensation that was surprising to me, because you would think in a tradition like Buddhism, there would be this emphasis on interbeing, interconnection, and all of this stuff. So I was surprised to feel that absence there.
Yeah, that's a deep well to explore. And I did an episode about this called Why Mindfulness Isn't Enough. And, all of it being done in recognition, first of all, of the tremendous benefit that Vipassana practice has had on numerous lives, and not as like some kind of rebuke or deep criticism of the Vipassana practice, but also, out of love for Buddhism and love for the practice, an offering of maybe some contextualization. And in that episode, I talked about how, first of all, those practices traditionally were not just solo isolationist practices. Those practices were part of a continuum of practices, and that continuum includes things like relational acknowledgement and ancestor candle lighting and recognition of animate forces that permeate the place. And over time, it's interesting to see, with the adoption of these practices by the Western world, it's interesting to see which elements tend to kind of get weeded out a little bit. And there's this sense that, like, oh, what's really important here is the solo isolationist part of the practice. What's really important is you alone with your own mind, you know. Well, why does the Western world tend to focus on that as the most important thing? It speaks to age-old historic dichotomy within the Western world, in which you could say formlessness is valued and form is vilified, or essence is considered to be the thing, and the actual matrix in which that essence takes place is not considered to be as important as, what lives at the very center. And I talk about it in another episode called When Bread is No Longer Bread, about how you find the like part of the orange that is the vitamin C, and you're like, aha, this is the vitamin C. We can extract the vitamin C and take it out because it's the important part. And then guess what? It turns out that all the other parts of the orange are essential for the body in assimilating and digesting the vitamin C. So actually, you need the whole contextual vision. And if you remove it from that, I wonder sometimes about the value of taking modern Western minds that are already in an individualist model, are already kind of isolated from what they consider to be kind of the objective world, already very bound up in their own process, very bound up in the machinations of their own minds, and then stick them on a cushion for multiple days and tell them, like, just pay attention to what is going on within yourself.
Hmm.
It's very different from a person who is raised, say, in 18th century Thailand, who is part of a very deep and very established relational web that is a familial web, a communal web, a clan web, a web that involves relationality with nagas, nature spirits, living land, who navigates relational protocol every single day of their life, and probably is participating in ritual systems that are very much focused on everyone playing their part and doing their assigned role, and fulfilling their role as a facet within that web. And so for that mind to spend some time going inward, it's different than a modern mind that is already so isolated and inward, spending so much time steeping in itself, which, and again, I'm not saying there's not value in it. There can be tremendous value in it. But I see modern minds and I see, wow, we need more practices that establish our relationality outwards. We need more practices that connect us. We need more practices, simple gratitude practices like the Thanksgiving address and
Yes.
the Haudenosaunee traditions, like simple practices where we are establishing the web of relationality and not jumping right to, like, well, the web is an illusion or the web is ultimately insubstantial. And, those realizations, the realization of the ephemerality of the web and that kind of thing, that's important at certain stages of practice. But if you, again, you take a modern Western mind that hasn't even established that web of relationality, a modern mind that is very much, I use the word orphaned more and more and more in describing
Hmm.
the modern Western mind, simply does not have its contextual systems established, simply often literally does not know which way is east and which way is west, which way is north and which way is south, literally can't find the North Star, literally doesn't know how to look for groundwater in an ecosystem, or like literally does not have a relational contextual body. And then you take it and tell it to focus more on itself, right? I think we need more practices of relationality. And the thing is that those practices are incredibly simple, and they're even in the Vipassana tradition. They're in the Buddhist tradition. They're certainly in the Tibetan tradition, which is incredibly relational. The Tibetan
Hmm.
tradition is about establishing relations and protocols with dozens and dozens and dozens of animate forces and local land beings and directional guardians and this kind of thing. And those types of practices get sidelined as the West adopts, traditional practices like Buddhism. And I think it's time to reclaim some of those practices.
Beautifully said and articulated. And I liked that metaphor there of what better way to realize that we're lost than knowing we don't know our directions. It's a really good point that you're making there. And the thing that jumped to my mind when you were speaking is what are some of those practices? If someone's listening and they go, okay, cool. So people were aware of this. They understood the importance of relationality. They baked in ritual and protocol and practice into this thing. What can I do to try to reclaim some of that stuff?
Yeah. And, luckily and fortunately, these practices are incredibly simple. They tend to be very consistent across cultures. So they're not like culturally owned, and so there's not a deep question of things like appropriation and that kind of thing. Like certainly if you're doing certain practices are culturally held, and it's good to respect that and value that. But a simple practice like offering gratitude to and naming aloud, because it's important to name aloud, naming aloud the beings of the local ecosystem to which we are offering gratitude. That's a practice that's been done everywhere in different ways. A daily practice of stepping outside and verbal acknowledgement of the insect beings and the birds and the diving fish and the amphibians and the reptiles and the mammals or the marsupials, depending on where you live, and the directions, and the stone and the earth beneath our feet, and the starry sky above and the celestial bodies, right? That simple practice of acknowledgement and gratitude, that is a very, very deep practice if you do it consistently over time. It's another thing that we kind of like in the modern Western world, where we're kind of like, oh, well, I want to jump to like the really complicated practices and okay, I got that whole gratitude thing. It's like, oh, you got it. Well, did you do it for 10 years? Did you actually do it every day for 10 years? And along with that, when I say like knowing which way the directions are, like it's, I mean, this is actually a real situation. Like, that like not knowing which way is east, not knowing where, if you live in the northern hemisphere, the North Star is, this type of thing. Like practices of what you could call orientation, and
Hmm.
four directional practices are common to global tradition everywhere. And establishing what can be called like a directional mandala, simply by connecting to each of the directions. And again, verbally out loud, just acknowledging our connection to each of the directions. This is practice that's been done everywhere. A practice that I teach in the course that I teach has to do with starting to understand the movements of the moon and understand the phases of the moon, and really start to connect to the moon multiple times a day by knowing where it is in the sky at any given time. And that's, a simple practice, but it's amazing what that type of practice does to anchor us. In animate traditions everywhere, there's a practice of simple offering food, offering incense, offering luminosity, a lamp, a candle of some kind, simple practices of offering, establishing ancestral connection, and establishing our connection to the spiraling web of, or the spiraling strand of genealogy that flows like right through each of our navels, right? Establishing that connection. So it's really like, and it goes on and on and on, but these practices are simple. It's the simple establishment and connection to a relational web. And, from
Hmm.
there, they get more intricate. There's more intricate rituals that are done, obviously, but the fundamental basics have to do with not just mentally understanding that there is a relational web, but actively somatically practicing connecting to it. That's the difference. And practicing in groups, like practicing in community. This is part of it too, so that it's not, I'm like, I grew up in a Buddhist household, and I have a deep love of Buddhism, And having grown up in a Buddhist household and been around it my entire life in certain ways, I also have my share of what you could call like deep philosophical questions and possibly critiques about that system. And I'm doing a whole piece right now on, the Bodhisattva vow and in Mahayana Buddhism, which I took for the first time when I was 7 years old, which is like basically the vow to take the burden of the suffering of all sentient beings on your shoulders and commit to pretty much individually liberate. Like, I'm not going to evolve until all beings are liberated. And I question whether that is a really truly relational model. And then, of course, the classic story of, because it has like savior undertones to it, and it has this kind of individualist bearing of the burden undertones to it. And the classic story of Avalokiteshvara is kind of a koan in this way, because Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, realizes the enormity of that vow, and it's so vast that his head explodes into 11 heads. His arms explode into 1,000 hands and 1,000 arms. And in a way, that's kind of saying an individual can't do this on their own, right? This isn't an individual burden that can be borne. It must be relational. It must be communal. You need thousands of hands. You need dozens of heads. And there are many, many Buddhist practitioners, obviously, who are very deeply involved in relational work, of course. But I think energetically, in the kind of larger religious systems, you see a tendency towards this individualist burden carrying that in traditional systems you don't see as much. You see instead systems of support. You see a relational web, and that relational web in a society and a culture, I'm speaking of the United States now where I live, a society and a culture that does not seem to want to have any discussion about like social safety net and relational web. It's going to be up to all of us to really deepen into what that means. What does a relational web look like? If it's not coming from, the governmental structure of a society, what does a relational web actually look like? A functional relational web.
That's an enormous question at the end there. And I like how we're swirling around Buddhism and concepts of bodhisattvas, and because all this stuff has been swirling in me since I was just at this thing. So it's great to be able to pick your brain and respond to these things, because I was thinking about the bodhisattva as well. And I didn't know that when you look at the school of Theravada Buddhism compared to Mahayana Buddhism, in Theravada, it's exceptionally rare for someone to be a bodhisattva, while in Mahayana Buddhism, it's possible that anyone can be a bodhisattva. So there are these little nuances. Well, maybe that's not even a nuance. That's maybe a pretty big demarcation between these things. To hear you talk about a bodhisattva as a kind of rugged individual savior who's messianic and will come and liberate everyone, I didn't see that before, but as you're saying it, I'm saying, yeah, of course, that's there. I saw it as in the opposite polarity, where it was this selfless, pure metta, pure giving, pure like dana, being in service. And it seems like it's both. There's this interesting tension, right? Like it's simultaneously, paradoxically, both of those at the same time.
Yeah, it's a very interesting paradox. I mean, the first line of the vow in some Mahayana traditions is beings without number, I vow to liberate. You know, I mean, yes, there is obviously, and then the way that that is done is through selfless giving and community and this type of thing. But there is a messianic aspect to that. I mean, think of me at age 7 when I had barely learned how to tie my shoes, chanting aloud, like, beings without number, I vow to liberate. Well, it's like, well, why don't we focus on learning our left from right first? And like, and this is something that I see in discourse these days, and the urgency with which we are seeking to save things, save the planet, save, you know, the cosmic burden sometimes is easier to bear than like, well, can you actually function within the relational web? Can you actually live up to your commitments within the relational web? It's easy to hold a sign that says, save this, save X, Y, and Z, save these grand principles, save the earth as a whole. It's easy to, make grand statements about what can be called like the burden of cosmic salvation, right? But it's a little trickier to actually get one's affairs in order and conduct one's life in a way that is receiving from and giving back to the web and in a healthy manner, and living up to one's word, like what one says one's gonna do. Like if I say I'm gonna do something, then following through, and like all the things that are part of what a functional relational web actually requires. That is the challenging work. And I'm doing an episode on cosmic burdens and or mythic burdens and cosmic support and visions of support in certain cultural traditions versus kind of vision of cosmic burden in other traditions. And what I mean by that is like, the cosmic burden, like the understanding that the vast turning wheel of samsara is something that I need to remedy, that I need to somehow remedy the entire, and then those, the number of worlds that's being talked about, the number of beings in that cosmology is like infinite, right? And that I need to reconcile somehow the cosmic salvific burden of billions upon billions upon billions of beings. um I'm still trying to remember how to like get my trash to the sidewalk on trash day. And like, you know and then it tends to be slightly different in smaller scale animate traditions. I mean, Buddhism is an animist tradition, but I think that salvation burden really comes into play in the larger religious traditions as they get larger and larger. The scope and the magnitude kind of grows. But in like smaller systems, you see that what's really valued and cherished as the purpose of human existence is not necessarily like, I am going to uplift all beings out of samsara, but it's, I am going to care for the relational web. I am going to fulfill my custodial role as a human being.
Hmm.
And that means listening and singing back. And there is a type of individual and communal alchemy that happens in that practice too. There is a journey of realization that happens. It's just that the stakes are not always pitted as these like cosmic stakes that the individual has to kind of bear the weight of themselves. And I wonder if individuals are really designed for that. I wonder. So to get back to your original point, I've seen more and more in my life what I would call a deep paradox in Buddhism, which in one way you can look at a Buddhist practitioner, a monk, and say, wow, this is so selfless. They've shaved their head, they've donned a robe, they don't have any possessions, they're giving everything up, kind of thing. And in another way, you could say, wow, that person sitting alone solo on the top of the mountain with their own mind, that's kind of like self-involved. Like
Hmm.
you know, that's not the like hunter-gatherer vision of what it means to like fulfill one's role within the great cosmic wheel, which has much more to do with navigating relationships and relational protocols. And again, I'm not like, I have a very deep love for Buddhism, and Buddhism has formed some of the deep foundation of my life. But I think that these questions are worth asking. I mean, eventually a serious Buddhist practitioner who also wants to be like in the world and of the world and have a family and be relational has to question a little bit the cosmology of, and you see it especially in Theravada Buddhism, the cosmology of this place is a giant shit wheel and I have to do whatever I can to get out. you know,
Yes.
like, and that really the purpose of the wheel of existence is to get out, and the universe is created by craving and desire and ignorance and this type of thing. And this is a very interesting thing because that piece at the center, that desire, that longing that creates existence, that came about at a certain point in Indian history when that was seen as like, oh, this is a bad thing. Whereas before, that desire, that longing, that kama that sparks creation into being, that was not seen as a bad thing. It was seen as like this primal longing of the universe to express. And so that cosmology, like the love and compassion for beings and the deep understanding of mind and the deep understanding of how to work with individual consciousness, all of that is deeply profound and beautiful. And then I really, since I was a teenager and still do question some of the overarching cosmology that I think can reinforce, especially when adopted in the West, certain imbalances in the Western framework that need to be possibly balanced. Trying to say it all nicely. Yeah.
Yeah, I everything you said just resonates, and there's so much there to respond to. And I didn't want to interrupt you as you were speaking, but one thing stood up for me that I wanted to jump on, which was something that was a point of friction for me when I was there. And you said that Buddhism is an animist tradition. And I was wrestling with this idea because, on one hand, I was thinking, yeah, there's tree veneration, there's the acknowledgement of invisible spirits, and you give metta to all beings. So I know that it's present in the framework. But then I was thinking that there's a certain tension there. There's a certain clash because there are these Buddhist concepts of karma as a chain of unbroken cause and effect, right? Originating from one's actions moment to moment. And then there's the animist concept that non-human forces are able to intervene directly and affect human lives. So I was kind of torn between the sense of this cold calculus of karma, right? Where it's like, is it this thing where all of my actions and it's just me as this isolated entity who's making decisions, who's craving and aversive, and I'm creating this endless cycle of karma for myself, and it's just me? Because that doesn't sound very relational. Like the animist worldview sounds much more relational, where there are these other forces at play. There are things that you have to negotiate. There are intervening forces, intermediaries. So how do we reconcile that kind of tension between the seeming contradiction between Buddhist concepts of karma and animist concepts of, a much more vibrant, shimmering, complicated world?
Well, I mean, if you look at Tibetan Tantra, if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, you see a system that navigates that, I think, fairly elegantly, in that the relational forces are acknowledged and honored, and sometimes a huge amount of any particular Tibetan tantric practice is focused on interrelationality with the directional guardians, and interrelationality with the water spirits, the nagas, and interrelationality with the Gandharvas and the classes of celestial beings and the varying protectors and land protectors and this type of thing. And there's this sense, and I've talked with Dr. Ben Jaffe about this at length, and he's someone to check out in relation to this topic because he's someone who came to the Tibetan tradition from a background in Western occultism as opposed to from a background in like Western kind of scientific postmodern worldview where a lot of people come to it from. And so he's really into unpacking like the animacies in Tibetan Buddhism. And in that tradition, it will be understood that these forces are profoundly real, and there's a relationship with all these forces that needs to be struck, and there's offerings that need to be made. And there's this understanding that ultimately all of this is a projection of consciousness, and it's part of the wheel of dynamic karma. And yes, like all of it has karmic root and origin, which I don't think ultimately takes away from the relational aspect of it. I think the problem that Westerners get into sometimes is when they hear that ultimately, quote unquote, all of these animacies are projections of consciousness, they assume that that means that they're not real, and they jump right to this kind of Western essentialist vision of consciousness where they say, oh, that means that they're all just in my head or they're not actually real. Well, you've got to understand again context. For the Tibetan practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, they are raised in an animist context. They are raised understanding that these things are absolutely, totally, utterly, tangibly real and interact with human beings every day. It is the water in which those traditions swim. So for the Buddha to balance that a little bit and say, hey, yes, nature spirits exist, and you don't want to get too caught up in the enduring tangibility of those spiritual forces, that makes sense. Then you take a Western mind and you say, like, ultimately, this is a unfolding projection of the fountain of, universal consciousness. And like, oh, that means that they're not actually real. And it plays into the mind body split in the Western tradition. You think about the Buddha and the time that the Buddha lived at a time when people were very much within the restrictions of social caste. There was ritual that was done, but it was facilitated by priests, and they were responsible for all of the mechanisms of that ritual. Maybe you did your village rituals away from the central ritual, but like the priests were basically kind of the arbiters of every cosmic interaction and every spirit interaction. And you lived in a world of very tangible, very concretized animate forces that you've been told since day one are absolutely, totally solid and real and this type of thing. And the Buddha was basically saying, like, hey, this has swung too far this way, and we've forgotten that these are forces that also live within us, and these are forces that we can work with within the field of our own consciousness. And that was absolutely revolutionary at that time to say, well, I won't say revolutionary because there were lots of schools of practice and thought in ancient India. And, there's a reason that it caught on. It caught on because anybody could practice, anybody could do it. You didn't need the facilitating Vedic priest. You didn't need to spend your entire gathered life savings to like do a ritual to do like it had, similar to like the time when Jesus came, there was a hyper ritualism that held the society in its grip, you could say. And so to say in times like those, hey, you don't need all this ritualism. You can sit with your breath on a mat and you can access the arising and falling of the universe. You can pacify the great demon armies, right, within yourself. You can
Mm.
establish this web of relationality within yourself. It was radical and it was necessary. But again, I mean, and this is interesting, even in the modern presence of Christianity in the Western world, that type of like rejection of ritual format and ritual structure serves a particular purpose at a particular time as a response to a particular era. Now we're talking about a time when we have no communal ritual structure in the Western world. People have largely rejected the like church structure, right? So again, to use that word orphans, we're kind of orphans adrift. We don't have things that we say together in the morning. We don't, as a culture en masse, we don't have things that we say before meals. We don't have, like in Vedic traditions, the ritual of before the birth of the child, after the birth of the child, the shaving of the head of the child, the naming of the child. We don't have these initiatory recognitions and this type of thing. So for us, I think there is a need to reacquaint ourselves with the necessity of navigating a world of form, of navigating the relational web, of doing rituals that are designed to establish us more deeply within that relational web. I think all of these things are necessary right now. And yeah, I don't know if that gets at your question, but that's what came.
That's what's passing through. Yeah, it touches on a lot of that stuff. It reminded me while you were speaking of an experience I had when I was at this Vipassana retreat about relationality in the context of ritual. And I don't know about you, but both times that I've been at an experience like this, my dreams become very strange and unusual. One night I had a dream that there was some really malevolent, energetic, spiritual force that was pursuing me. And I woke up, and I woke up in the room alone, and there was this shadowy indistinctness in the corner, and I just had this sense, oh my God, there's something terrible here. I was panicking, you know, so I'm like fumbling, reaching behind me to get the light switch and turn it on so I could just banish whatever was there. And I turn it on, and I still feel that there's something there, which was even more deeply unsettling. So, I'm in the room and I'm like, oh my God, I just woke up. What is this? What's happening? I don't know what to do. I still feel like there's something that wishes to harm me in this room. And the only thing that I thought to do was like try to practice metta on it and just give it peace, give it love, give it compassion. And surprisingly, it worked. Like the feeling went away, the presence seemed to drift and evaporate, and it was gone. And I was really struck by the experience. And I was speaking to one of the servers at breakfast, and I said, "Yeah, I had a terrible nightmare, and it was one of those nightmares where it stayed with me when I woke up." And he joked, he's like, "Did you give it metta?" And I was like, "Actually, I did." And he goes, "What happened?" I said, "It went away." And he goes, "You know the story of how metta came to be, right?" And I said, "No." And he told me the story of these meditating monks in the forest. I'm sure you know the story. And they're panicking because there are these devas and things terrorizing them. And they go to the Buddha, and the Buddha is telling them, "Oh, I see, you can't meditate. You're being terrorized. Give these beings the love and compassion." And they go back and they do it. And these beings become protectors and guardians of the monks. And it was a really beautiful story. And it was so weird to have had that experience, not knowing any of that context, any of that, because that's a deeply animist story. And it's an animist practice because you are acknowledging beings who are not corporeal necessarily, not human for sure. And I was like, yeah, there are these threads of animacy like deeply interwoven into the practice, but the way it's taught and the way that people speak about it is almost solely about like personal liberation, personal enlightenment, personal optimization, like this type of stuff. And yeah, this is where I was feeling the tension. I know in Tibetan Buddhism, as you were just describing, is much more, out of all of the schools, it's the one that's the most permissive and the most open. I don't know what word I would use to describe it, but I see what you're saying there, but I wonder why in these other schools it seems more absent.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. One thing that's interesting, I mentioned this in the mindfulness episode that I did. There's a record of Bhikkhu, a Thai monk who used to use metta as, we have this kind of idea of metta as like, oh, just kind of send nice thoughts and like, and there are descriptions in esoteric Theravadan texts in which metta is much more of an actual animate force that people are working with, and that there's ways to cultivate it and actualize it that are much more akin to working with qi in the Chinese traditions. And that I found very interesting, or kundalini in the tantric traditions. There's even descriptions from these esoteric Theravadan texts that talk about shining metta and like blazing metta, and metta as an actual substance as opposed to
Hmm.
just like, metta meditation, having grown up with it, can be beautiful, but it can also be one of the drier kind of meditations if it's just kind of thought of as like, now I'm going to send loving thoughts to my family. Now I'm going to send loving thoughts to Trump. Now I'm gonna, like, and the loving thoughts are just kind of these abstract, like, gee, I wish you well. And like, may all beings be happy. And like, I think it's worth deepening into this vision of metta as an actual animate force, what in the Japanese traditions is called joriki, which has like such an incredible sound to it, right? Joriki, like this vibrant, pulsing energy, this real energy of love that one can work with. And that particular bhikkhu knew how to use metta to stop charging elephants. So he could harness metta, the loving kindness, as an animate force and stop charging elephants. And according to him, this might be a refinement for the next time you encounter something like this. But according to him, he said, you don't focus on the being. There's a point that lives like right above the being, and you focus the metta on that point that is like the guide point for that being. You focus on the guide point for that being, and then, because if you just focus on the elephant, you'll still get crushed. That's what he said. That's what he said. But if you focus on the guide point, then that'll calm and pacify the elephant. So for all the listeners who may encounter themselves in a position where they might need to stop charging elephants, like now you have a technique. um,
Very
you know,
practical.
I think that, again, the animism, I mean, it's very alive in Tibetan traditions, but there also is what you could call a salvation undertone to it, which is the work with these forces of land, is the work with these nagas, or the work with these energies that are going to become protectors. This is something I've talked with Ben about. Ultimately, I'm trying to, as a Lama practitioner, I'm trying to convert them, or I'm trying to, and the Tibetan histories are full of stories of kind of sorcerer, shaman, magician lamas whose work is to liberate or convert local land deities, to bring them into the dharmic fold, to get them to take their vows so that they too may one day be liberated. And again, there's a beauty to this. And I'm not like, I think that people tend towards binary discourse these days. So people might be thinking that I'm like saying like, liberation doctrine is the problem. And no, there's times when liberation is a very appealing, like, yeah, get me out of here and let's free each other. And let's like, let's get out of the wheel. And that has its place too. But that can't be the only vision. It can't be the only vision. The idea that these beings have lives and agendas, that ecology exists beyond the kind of vision of like, oh, someday ecology needs to resolve itself into nothingness, or someday ecology needs to resolve itself out of samsara. If you get too hung up on that, you're actually missing the central message. If you get too hung up on liberation. And there are stories and stories of this in the Buddhist tradition. There's the wonderful Zen koan of Hyakujo and the fox, in which the Zen monk Hyakujo goes to his teacher, and the teacher asks him as kind of a test, because Hyakujo is claiming that he's kind of, hey, I'm onto something. I may be liberated. Like I might be enlightened, like, which is always a bad thing to do if you're a Zen student. If you study the stories, if you if you go to the teacher and tell them that you're enlightened, you're bound to get like hit with a hammer, or like, um, and the teacher says, well, tell me then, is the enlightened being above the wheel of causation or not? And Hyakujo says, of course, the enlightened being is above the wheel of causation. That's the whole point, right? The whole point is to be above the wheel of causation. And because of this answer, Hyakujo reincarnates as a fox 500 times, right? And like, that's a paradox of recognition within the Buddhist tradition itself, that the moment you think enlightenment or pure presence, or whatever you want to talk about it, or salvation, is anything but pure presence, pure relationality, like anything but something that can be realized here and now in relationship within the wheel or the web, then you've gone astray. So there's this paradox within the Zen tradition that you are striving without striving, right? Who doesn't want to uplift the situation of their community and their ecology, you know? But if that takes the form of like savior doctrine, right? If that takes the form of like, I am here to liberate all of you, well, you can look at history and see how often that works. And you can look at the problems with that and everything from Christian missionary tactics to honestly modern day environmental activism. Like you can see it in many places. And so there's a beautiful part at the end of the koan that says he thoroughly enjoyed his fox body. And when it was finally time for him to let it go, the koan says, Hyakujo says, please bury it as you would a deceased monk, right? So everything, every aspect of the wheel of life, every aspect of the animate web is the vehicle through which we realize and through which we practice presence and through which we practice love and through which we practice compassion. It's not waiting some distant day down the road. So I think infusing a little bit more of that relational immediacy, and there are many Buddhist teachers who talk about this, of course, like it's there. But I think that what you're pointing at, understanding that our relationship with the relational web is not one of salvation, but one of recognition and acknowledgement and interaction with, I think that allows us to actualize teachings on love and compassion that are more in alignment with what love actually is, right? How many people in a relationship confuse the words, I love you, with, I'm going to fix you, right? You
Hmm.
feel what I mean? This is a very common thing. I'm just stopping myself because there's a whole spiral we could go down there, but I want to see where you want to take the conversation.
Yeah, I'm torn because I would love to keep digging into Buddhism, but I feel like that's an endless rabbit hole that we could just get mired in. And there were topics I wanted to explore, like music. So maybe we could pivot a little bit to music to get us into a new space, because music seems like such an integral part of the Emerald, and it's been a lifelong passion for me as well. And I always love how you find the perfect song to accompany the subject of an episode, and it gives me the impression that music is also really important to you. So I just wanted to dig into that a bit and talk about music. And do you play music?
Yeah, I play music not on the level of like a musical maestro, but I play enough music to be able to produce music. I learned quite a bit about producing music when I was fairly young. And it's interesting because the Emerald is kind of a confluence culmination of so many of my life interests that I had always regarded as kind of separate, and then realized slowly that they could all be one thing. And this, I feel, is a beautiful invitation for creative minded people who might have disparate interests in their lives, that there's ways to weave them together, there's ways to bring them together. So I was always, completely into music and worked with I was in a band when I was younger, and then went on to be a hip hop DJ for quite a number of years. And which is why, if people are wondering why Emerald episodes are nearly always punctuated with some 90s hip hop song or other, like that's why. That's coming straight out of the record crates in my garage. and, uh, and, and I was a storyteller and I was a spiritual practitioner, and it was always a little bit interesting trying to balance and navigate these different worlds. And I always thought, like, okay, well, I'm not a musician because I'm not a virtuoso guitarist, or I'm not like, an amazing vocalist or anything like that. What role does it actually play in my life? But then through the podcast, I found that there is a place for the musically driven storyteller. And in fact, that place is the original vision of the storyteller. The original bardic vision of the storyteller is someone who invokes spoken word to rhythmic music. And this has been happening in culture upon culture upon culture for thousands and thousands of years. And that place isn't highly recognized in the world today as it used to be. We've got, singer songwriters and musicians and bands and this type of thing over here. Then we've got the whole kind of spoken word poetry scene over here, which, I'll be honest, like, I was in that scene very briefly in like the late 90s, early 2000s, but I find it very restrictive and flat, honestly. And I
Hmm.
know maybe it's changed a little bit recently, but there are rhythmic and tonal expectations of that art form that I think are very narrow compared to what it could be. Like, a lot of it became rage poetry, which is important. It's important to have rage poetry. But when the entire medium becomes like, it's expected to be at this cadence and it's expected to be like rapid machine gun fire of words and everything like that. Well, you look at the good hip hop artists and they don't restrain themselves like that. One of the incredible things about like people like Kendrick Lamar is like the ability to find all of these rhythmic and tonal textures, slowing down the words, and then going back to geniuses like ODB from the Wu-Tang Clan, who's able to turn a nonsensical phrase and just repeat it with so much conviction that it becomes an anthem, right? Bards have always worked with the ability to squeeze words and draw the nectar out of words and expand when they need to and shrink when they need to and pause in silence when they need to. And this is like, this is how the voice of the bard or the storyteller links with the animate forces and is able to actually transmit something. And if the cadence and the delivery is just one note, if it's just rage poetry, then the opportunities, like Bootsy Collins said, the funk is the space between the notes. Like, the funk is the space between the notes, then the opportunities for the animate force, in this case being described as the funk, the opportunities for the animate force to get through have lessened if you just have that kind of rapid fire cadence. So I know you started asking about music, and I kind of went on a little bit of a spiral here, but reclaiming the bardic mechanisms of invocation in a way that allows the animate presence, the force of life of the cosmos, space to move and breathe and can vibrate when it needs to vibrate and can soothe when it needs to soothe. And this, I think, is art form that was very available to our ancient ancestors. And I think we need it in this day and age because art needs to transmit. The entire point, if we want to talk in terms of points, the entire point of art is an energetic transmission, a living energetic transmission. It's not to make you conceptually think of something and go, aha, like, what a genius way of, depicting the struggle between proletariat, da 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 da. Like, like, yeah, there's art like that is never going to actually really move much because it's not within the language of transmission. And transmission is how human beings learn. Transmission is how we feel. When a storyteller tells a story that has some juice to it, some nectar to it, it transmits something. And I've had teachers and storytellers in my life who were able to tell very, very simple stories that transmitted so much. And so I'm not claiming to be some transmitter of whatever, but I'm trying to be someone who uses the simple tools of music, sound, cadence, speech, delivery in order to create space so that something palpable and tangible might move through. So I love music. This cosmos is made of music, in case you haven't heard, which I'm sure you have. And 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 music and vibration are at the heart of reality. And so if we want to accurately storytell or accurately describe what it's like to be a human being, or accurately describe this universe of joys and sorrows and this universe of rare beauties, then music must be involved because it's a musical cosmos.
That's an answer that's so beautiful. I don't have anything to bounce off of that. That's yeah, thank you for that. I'll just say thank you, give gratitude. Um, there's more stuff I want to dig in there because music is another Pandora's box of stuff. But a simple
We can go
question.
deeper into it if you want. Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start simple and we could scale up again. You said you were in a band. What were you playing?
This was in the era of Rage Against the Machine and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and I was the vocalist who was screaming about the downfall of the system and writing lyrics about wild sunsets and mountains and uh, the end of civilization and, and and all this kind of thing. And I'm still kind of doing that. So I guess I was onto something at that young age. And many of the folks who are in that band are doing their various musical projects. One of the guys is a guitarist who I've featured on the podcast a bunch, and actually the bass player Walker, he's been on the podcast a bunch too. And actually, like, yeah, 4 out of the 5 members have kind of been featured on the podcast. So I'm still in touch with all of them. But yeah, this was a very long time ago. And then went from there into spoken word and DJing um, and all of it.
So there's still a chance of getting the band back together and doing some anti-Trump, anti-authoritarian, tear down the machine stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still a chance. Yeah, in an infinite universe, there's always a chance. Yeah, there is a there's some old recordings that might start to make their way into certain podcast episodes, just to kind of give people a little taste. You know, there is
Nice.
also some of the stuff that we did that I find fairly cringy now, but that's how you learn as an artist, and uh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And luckily, this all happened before the internet, so try to find it, people. You won't.
But yeah, there was this other question that I had, a more philosophical question. Because for me, when music is good, it's so deeply connective. It's it becomes deeply ritualistic, deeply sacred. It's almost as though, I mean, maybe I wouldn't say almost as though, music is an animate force. And when we are together in a group and there's music, we enter into this kind of thrall. It can be rapturous, could experience dissolution and all of these really ecstatic states. And music is a form to me of almost like spirit possession. When people are experiencing music together, it is profoundly transcendent. And I wonder why that is. What is it about music? It's just vibration, right? It's just sound, vibration. Why is that so powerful?
I would just take out the just in that sentence. Like, it's just vibration, and say it's vibration. And that's, this is a vibrational universe. The universe is architected of vibration, and it manifests in harmonics. The structures of creation are mathematically harmonic. And the intervals that exist within creation, the intervals that exist that form the way that the human body forms, and the way that plants form, and the way that star clusters form, and the way that planetary orbit patterns form, these are musical. They're musical in nature. So the ancient understandings of the music of the spheres, this isn't like some overlay they put on the cosmos. This is actually mathematically right at the heart of the structure of creation. There are musical intervals that are universally seen as sad, right? there are musical intervals that are universally felt as uplifting, right? The reason for this is that it's in the architecture, it's in the vibrational architecture. So, music, the bodies of the goddesses, say the Tantras, are sonic. The animate forces are sonic, the spirit forces are sonic, they're vibrational, which is why invocation is used even in good old silent vipassana, quote unquote, silent vipassana. You chant at the beginning, right? And you chant at the
Yes.
beginning, and what does that do to your mind? It vibrationally smooths the agitated vibrational brain waveform currents and patterns and the field around you. And it is literally directed and smoothed by the chanting, the mantra,
Yes.
right? The traverse that happens in the mantra is the traverse from kind of agitated, discombobulated vibrational space to coherent, mandalic, harmonic vibrational space. So the sonic frequencies, the animate forces are sonic in nature. And, you look at traditions like the West African tradition, and they understand that rhythms are particular animate beings. They understand that instruments are particular animate beings and that the song has a life of its own. And
Hmm.
those rhythms, those West African rhythms, really Pan-African rhythms, but primarily West African rhythms. Those West African rhythms form the basis of 90+% of modern popular music. And when those rhythms first arrived and got, syncretized into jazz and into blues and into rock and roll, look what they did to people. They sent people into states of spirit possession. There's no other way to describe it. You look at footage of 1950s kids at a Little Richard concert, and they are screaming and crying and wailing and collapsing on the floor. And this is spirit possession. And because we did not have a cultural context for it in the West, it was incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful. Now, traditionally, that all would have been facilitated from a spiritual perspective. It would have been known what to do with people who are having these great awakenings and these, like, you know, in the modern individualized West, all of that gets focused on the rock star, right? All of it gets focused on the individual artist. And the individual artist, the burden of that is one that an individual being can't bear. And so people think they're gods and throw themselves at them like gods, and they respond by getting into like debauchery and this type of thing. And that's understanding the power and potency of sound and vibration, but then not having a contextual framework in which that can live, right? There's a story that I told in
Hmm.
an old episode about drumming, a Sumerian story in which Gilgamesh performs a particular task for the goddess, and she rewards him by giving him a drum, but he's half god, half human, and is prone to getting a little bit carried away with his human sentiments. So he takes the drum, and instead of using it as a means of reconnection to the great cosmic tree from whom its wood comes, uses it instead to cause men to fight each other and to seduce women and this type of thing. And that's a like 4,000-year-old story probably, that says something about sound and music and its power to change people's moods and its dynamic vibrational ability to to possess and to take people down a particular path. And it's powerful. And like all things powerful, traditional systems have had ways and protocols of working with that power. So music in the West still serves what you can call a sacred role, except we don't recognize it as sacred. And then it becomes all the kind of burden of the individual artists. And I'd love to see more what you could call ritualized music, in which it's understood that the music that lives at the center is sacred. And I know that there's more and more bands that are kind of experimenting with that, with like musical ritualism and this kind of stuff. because now we've kind of reached, I think, the end of the age when the rock and roll song can drive people into a frenzy because it's just kind of everywhere and it's background noise and this type of thing. Now we need to expand our vision of what music can do and be, and maybe find the sacred in it once again.
Hmm. Another incredible answer. I'm still amazed at the concept. I thought of music as animate, but rhythms themselves as animate is, yeah, that's something that's going to be moving in me for a while. So thank you for sharing that, and the imagery of Little Richard, and I'm thinking of like Chuck Berry and all this kind of music that was coming out, and yeah, even the Beatles. When you think back to the Beatles, like girls, just same thing, in tears, apoplectic, just crazy, deranged.
Yeah, well, the reason I said
Um,
Little Richard is because in that Little Richard documentary, he was like, "Ha, the Beatles." He was like, "Girls were throwing their underwear at me in the 1950s." Like, Little Richard has a claim to the one who really, really started rock and roll, and that claim was not recognized for a long time. So it's good to give credit where credit is due. But he was describing scenes of mass catharsis and mass, what can be called hysteria and like spirit possession that were happening like in the 1950s in a culture that was really, really not, the only place that you were supposed to have those types of experiences was at a church revival, right?
mm,
And Little Richard's father was a preacher. He was a preacher who moonlighted as a whiskey producer and nightclub owner. And Little Richard went through this like incredible life trajectory of total and complete debauchery, followed by like giving it all up and embracing Christ, followed by total and complete debauchery, followed by like giving up. And it shows something about our Western relationship with these types of powerful forces. Either it gets marshaled into kind of overtly repressive religious structures, or it lives in the field of total debauchery. And this is like the Western mind body split in action again. It's the Western dichotomy around this stuff, where ultimately we need ecstasy, we need experiences of ecstasy. They're fundamental to human life, and they are sacred, right? And if we de-sacralize ecstasy, on the one hand, you get dry religious ritual that nobody really wants to go to because they don't feel any ecstasy at all in like eating a little cracker and drinking grape juice, and on the other side, you get debauchery. And bridging that, something I talk about in an episode I did on festivals, but bridging that by returning a sacred vision of ecstasy, I think is deeply important. But I think what modern festival culture has to understand is that that requires a lot more focus than is sometimes actualized in modern festival culture. You're not like re-enshrining the sacred just by paying lip service to it and like having a Reiki tent at your festival or a frog medicine tent at your festival. Like to actually re-infuse something with sacredness, it takes slow, steady, deep work and attention. And possibly in traditional systems anyway, takes some type of slow, progressive, initiatory structure too, right? You can't just, because I get a lot of inquiries from festivals who are like, yeah, we want to, incorporate some elements of ritual. And we really want this to be a sacred thing. And it's like, well, if you really want it to be a sacred thing, like that's a multi-year project. That is something that takes focus and cohesion. And it's not just like, yeah, let's pile on more sacred offerings at the festival. Um,
mm.
yeah. So another wormhole that we could go down.
Yeah, and I know we're at time now, and I didn't hope or expect that my last question to you would be about what your thoughts on Burning Man are, but I am curious because when I was living in San Francisco, I used to go, and to me, the thing that Burning Man I don't know what it is like now. I haven't been in some time, but back then there was this sense of something more, something sacred, particularly at the temple, which was the kind of spiritual center of the space. Have you ever been to Burning Man?
Yeah, I've actually never been. So I lived in San
Okay.
Francisco, and like way back in 1997, I got invited to go. And then my friend was like, "Oh, I hear that event is totally like corporately sold out and everything." And this was in 1997, right? They're like, "Oh, that's a bunch of corporate sellouts." And I was like, "Yeah, man, screw that event." And like, you know, like kind of shows where I was at the at the time too. So I never went, and I have friends who have been deeply involved for many years and have obviously talked to me about like, neo ritualism and the model there, and sounds to me like there are great beauties to that model, and then also, there are challenges, and when your event has like private landing strips for tech billionaires and people are thanking Elon Musk on stage, then I wonder about it a little bit. Uh,
Yes.
but like, you know, the model of wanting to embrace, a communal ritualism, I think is a deeply needed model. And I guess the heart of what I'm saying is that I think it takes even more focus than people are giving it. I think that even just like if you talk about like the coherence of the field, even just knowing that people are on 10 or 15 different substances and what that does to the coherence of a field. You don't have, like in a traditional peyote ceremony, you don't have the one guy who's in the corner who decided to drink ayahuasca instead, because there are particular energies and particular forces and particular ways that you're working. So, for what it is, for what a lot of these kind of festivals are, I think obviously they're seeking to do really good and powerful work, and I'm sure that people are having profound life-changing experiences there. And for what they are, they're serving a purpose, and I think that's great. But I think it's also worth looking into what would a more coherent field be? How would that be actualized? How would a more coherent field be actualized? Maybe it's a group of people who study with each other across the country for a couple of years and then come to this like slightly smaller thing, and everyone's fasting and everyone's focused around the same thing, and there's just ways to start to deepen the vision that I think would align it more to the spirit of ancient festivals, or festivals that I've been to in India, for example, over many years. And I think that starts with like really seeking to understand what it means to navigate and co-create a field together, a vibrational field, a coherent field. I've been to rituals in India where the field was so pristine and coherent that the animate forces, the really finer animate forces, could play and dance and move and have space to breathe. But those finer forces, if the field is clunky, if the field is jagged, there are places in India, and this is just an example, I'm not saying this is something I believe, but there are places in India where it's like, if one person enters that field who eats beef, like they consider the entire field to have been vibrationally disrupted, and it's like, got to start over again.
Mm.
And again, I'm not saying I believe in that, because I know friends from all across the dietary spectrum, but it's worth understanding that, like, imagine and you can see this in the dieta traditions, in South America, the traditions of working with particular plants and fasting around plant medicine, and the question of like, okay, how coherent, how harmonically vibrant and flowing, can this field be? A lot of that depends on our ability to value that, first of all, and then to deepen into understanding what brings that quality about. And it's a step in the right direction to say, okay, we're not just like doing whippets in the corner and like, noodling around at our Grateful Dead show. We're going to have a focal point, energetic Burning Man focal point at the center, and there's going to be kind of a cohesion around that. It's a step in the right direction, but that's only a very small step as I see it. As I see it. I've been to festivals in India where there were 1 million people and no alcohol in the field, for example. And
Mm.
uh, you know, that's something. It's something to feel 1 million people who are completely focused on a sacred mountain at the same time, in silence. You ever heard 1 million people in silence? Like that's something. And those festivals too, obviously, it's like mass groups of people. You're going to get all kinds of, you're going to get a range of human experience, but often not enough attention, I think, for those who are wanting to reinfuse the sacred. Not enough attention is paid to the quality and dynamics of the energetic field, which again means, to bring it full circle, getting out of just kind of our concepts of like, the purpose of this is to have a really great individual experience, to what actually facilitates group alchemy, what actually facilitates an alchemy of the relational web.
Hmm. Mic drop. I know we're over. I just want to give you the last minute for anything you wanted to promote or anything you have coming up. Just for you to use the space as you want before we close out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a whole lot of promotion. I have the podcast. I have a Patreon study group where we talk about mythic topics twice a month. It's patreon.com/the Emerald podcast. See, I don't even know my own URLs. and then I teach a year-long deep dive course into these mythic topics too. So those are really the areas where I focus this work. And yeah, would love to share with anyone who wants to explore those things deeper.
Okay. Thank you, Josh, from deep in my heart. This was a pleasure and honor. It was great to hear your stories and your insights and listen to everything, all of your vibrations that you put out. And yeah, this was a gift for me. So I'm really happy to have had some time with you. So thank you for your time. Sorry for running over. And
No, this is exactly the amount of time that I had booked for it. So
okay.
Yeah.
Amazing.
No, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it, buy a billboard somewhere next to a highway promoting it. I mean, I'm kidding, of course, but your support really does mean a lot to me. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.